Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Some White Guy Mansplains Intersection of Feminism with Jake Ryan. I'm your host, Jake Ryan, and this week's episode is going to focus on sexual violence and femicide. It could be difficult for many people because these issues are so much more prevalent than they should be. If it's simply too much, take care of yourself and step away. But if you have it in you to hear this message, know that we need to be talking about this more. Silence benefits perpetrators, and that's obviously unacceptable. Because I've been working in this field around sexual violence for so long, I forget sometimes how hard it is to talk about, but I promise you, this issue isn't going to go away on its own. Men, who commit the vast majority of sexual violence, aren't simply going to stop perpetrating harm without us talking about it. Giselle Pellicot, the French woman who has been in the news lately because her husband drugged her and allowed her to be raped by many men over the span of a decade, has exhibited great courage in allowing the details of her case to be made public. She said that shame must change sides. She and other victims and survivors didn't do anything wrong, so it's only right that we make rapists feel ashamed for harming others. I've been working against sexual violence for about 13 years now, but it's been 17 years since I was first confronted with the reality of rape. If you've seen or heard every episode of this podcast so far, you know that I'm not here to sugarcoat things. Unfortunately, the world can be a dangerous place. The realities of the world we live in are very uncomfortable for people. So many people live in denial or willful ignorance of the facts. Because violence disproportionately affects marginalized people, women, people of color, and especially women of color, are the most affected by issues like sexual violence. And it's most often perpetrated by those with the most privilege, men, who are the least likely to be held accountable. I was raised in a super sheltered home, and though I knew what rape was before going to college, I had barely given it any thought. I had internalized this idea that it only happened on rare occasions when a man jumps out of the bushes or grabs a woman in a parking garage, and believed that it was unfortunate but inevitable. Then, in my second weekend at San Diego State University, I found myself having to save a woman I didn't even know from being raped, kidnapped, and God only knows what else might have happened to her had I not been there. I quickly learned that there are bad people in the world who don't really care about the people they harm and only care about themselves. A few years later, I took a class that taught about rape culture, including how women are portrayed in media and beliefs and attitudes that contribute to rape and the defense of its prevalence. In this class, I learned that 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 women will experience attempted or completed rape in their lives, and that many women who have been raped experience multiple instances of sexual assault. For the past 13 years since that class, I have never been able to get over that fact, or that we just walk around as though this is acceptable. What this means is that you absolutely know survivors of sexual assault, even if you don't know that the women in your life are survivors. And, to be clear, it is not only women who experience sexual violence, but they are certainly the most heavily impacted demographic. In a moment, I will address sexual violence against men and against trans people. One heavily influential part of rape culture is what we call rape myths. These are ideas that attempt to explain or even justify sexual violence. Ideas like, Well, she got raped because she drank too much, or did you see what she was wearing? Or she was dancing very suggestively. It sure seemed like she wanted the attention. These are disgusting ideas that seek to shame the victim, like Giselle Pellico said, rather than placing the blame where it belongs, on rapists. A woman can wear whatever she wants, she can drink as much as she wants, and she can dance however she wants, and at no point do any of her choices forfeit her right to bodily autonomy. No one else has a right to anyone else's body, ever. Rape is caused by rapists and those who enable them. I also want to take a moment to talk about the usage of the words victim and survivor to address people who have been affected by sexual violence. Victim is typically used in legal settings because rape is a crime, and a person who has been raped is a victim of a crime. However, victim generally has connotations of brokenness and being disempowered, so therapists and those in public health will often use the word survivor to acknowledge the fact that the person is not defined by having been raped, and to acknowledge the work that people have done to move from victimhood to survivorhood. It's also important to note that rape is about power, not sex. It is often intended to degrade or humiliate the victim and reinforce men's power over women. Even if the majority of rape is committed by a small percentage of men, all men benefit from the behaviors of rapists because women are taught to be constantly on the defense since they don't know which men do and do not wish to harm them. I mentioned just a few moments ago that rapists are enabled by other men and sometimes by women. I hope that by now I have adequately established that men have more systemic power than women and people of other genders, and in not using this power to call out rape culture and the behaviors of men that count as sexual violence, men are implicitly endorsing rape. It is the responsibility of the privileged to use the power they are unfairly given to advocate for those with less power. If you associate with a man who you know abuses his power over women or others, whether through the use of date rape drugs, coercion, intimidation, or force, and you say or do nothing, you are an accomplice. Sexual violence happens so much more regularly than most people care to acknowledge, and it is an uncomfortable fact to know that you may have friends, family, or coworkers who are rapists. A close female friend of mine once told me, "I think the reason most men don't want to think about what consent entails is because if they did, they'd have to acknowledge to themselves that they are rapists." It isn't always about the intent to rape, but if you do not explicitly check for consent before and during sexual activity, and especially if you ignore your partner's hesitance or unenthusiastic involvement, that constitutes rape, and it is appropriate to feel guilty about it. Impact matters more than intent, and if a person feels violated, it doesn't matter if you didn't intend to make them feel that way. There are many reasons a person might not choose to report having been raped. Among these are knowing that our justice system is flawed, that it often comes down to a he said, she said situation, and that his word will matter more than hers, and being made to doubt whether what happened to them was actually rape, which can be a result of victim blaming. Because sexual violence is often committed by someone close to the victim, that adds an extra layer of trauma and makes it harder to disclose because people might be quick to defend the perpetrator. Many victims do not expect to be believed or treated with compassion, and they know that pursuing justice often results in more pain, with little to no reward. According to RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, only 6% of rapists ever end up in jail. RAINN also estimates that only about 2/3 of rapes are reported, and that only about 4% of accusations are false accusations, which is on par with false accusations for any other crime. There are some bad faith actors, often deeply misogynistic, who like to think of themselves as men's rights activists. Even though it is rare, and their efforts would be better directed at real problems, these people hyper-focus on the possibility that a person is making it up to damage a man's reputation. Although we hear about people getting canceled, Louis C.K., who has been credibly accused of sexual assault by many women, is still selling out stadiums for his shows, as is Chris Brown, who has been accused of sexual violence and many instances of domestic violence. Johnny Depp, who treated Amber Heard horribly, both in their marriage and in their legal proceedings after, is still getting work. The fact that he said he wanted to burn her alive and then rape her corpse somehow isn't a deal breaker for studio directors and much of the general public. Many were happy to take his side, simply because this society hates women. Another bad faith argument is that women who say they were raped are only doing it to get attention. Oh really? Name 3 women who accused Bill Cosby, or Louis C.K., or Harvey Weinstein. Name 1 woman whose life is better off because she reported her assault. Now, I know this episode is getting dark, so again, take a break if you need to, because I have one more term I want to share with you that is pretty heavy and overall just a fucked up concept. There's a term I've learned about in my studies called corrective rape, which is a term that applies to the hate crime of the rape of lesbians and trans people. With lesbians, it's seen as a punishment for rejecting men, and with trans people, it's seen as an effort to remind individuals that they are wrong to be trans. As I said before, rape is about power, not sex. Some women in my life have said that they believe being raped is more cruel than being murdered, and I very much agree. A person has to live with the consequences of having been raped, and having worked with survivors in therapy, I've seen the damage that rape can cause and how much effort it takes for people to rebuild themselves after. On her experience with corrective rape, Hannah Gadsby says in Nanette, "It would have been more humane to just take me out to the back paddock and put a bullet in my head if it is that much of a crime to be different." My heart breaks to know that this has happened to her and countless others, but it also made me so happy to see Hannah bravely share her story, overcoming the belief that she should be quiet and ashamed. No one ever deserves to be violated, and I will never shut up about that. Take a deep breath or more if you need to regulate, because it's natural for us to have a visceral reaction to some of humanity's darkest realities. We all have the capacity to cause harm, and we are all capable of being victimized. I'm talking here about how men can also be raped, which is especially difficult for survivors because we live among male rape myths, such as the idea that men don't get raped. In fact, my dissertation is on the experiences of cis men who were raped by other cis men. In it, I explore 4 male rape myths, which many of us have internalized without consciously recognizing them. In addition to the idea that men can't be raped, there's also the attitude that a real man can fight off any attacker, that if a man is raped, he isn't that affected by it, and that he's likely not affected because a man who is raped must actually be gay, and therefore he wanted to have sex, so no crime was committed. As we saw last episode, homophobia works to keep many men performing heteromasculinity for fear that they will be ostracized or otherwise harmed. One of the pressures of masculinity is to constantly appear tough. So even if a man is sexually violated, he suffers even more because he feels he has to appear unaffected. It's also hard for people to believe that a man could be raped because men are framed as always wanting, ready, and able when it comes to sex. When a boy or man is raped by a woman, he is often congratulated. People do not even think of him as the victim of a crime because his experience matches the expectations of his gender role. Men are supposed to fuck. A minor cannot consent to sex with an adult, and some people like to argue that this is simply legal semantics, that of course the teenage boy who slept with his teacher or babysitter wanted it. But it's important to note that our frontal lobe doesn't finish developing until we're 26, and that is why minors can't consent. When it's an adult man and an underage girl, it's much easier for people to recognize statutory rape than when the roles are reversed. Some boys and men who are raped by women may not feel violated, and in those cases, that's great. But we need to hold space for the boys and men who do feel violated. If part of you is feeling some resistance right now towards having empathy towards men, even those who have been sexually victimized, I get it. Author Warren Farrell said that our anger towards men as victimizers blinds us to men as victims. Yes, roughly 98 to 99% of sexual violence is perpetrated by cis men, and there are many reasons to not want to feel bad for men. Patriarchy empowers men, and, as we've seen, privilege can make someone an asshole. But the focus of my dissertation is to show that everyone who has been violated is deserving of compassionate support, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We're now done discussing sexual violence, but I want to move on to another form of violence that's also far too prevalent, and that's femicide. Defined as the killing of a woman or girl, in particular by a man and on account of her gender, estimates of femicide are often on the low side because we can't always know the motivation for their murder. Globally, there are about 80,000 instances of femicide a year, or 219 women every day. That's 9 women every hour, or 1 every 6 to 7 minutes, meaning that 2 to 3 women have been killed since the start of this episode. Of these, roughly 45 to 50,000 are by a family member or past or present intimate partner. As much as 56 to 62% of femicides are by family and intimate partners. Just like with rape, it's often the men a woman is closest to that are most likely to harm her. As I said in the second episode of this series, on gender roles, men and women have very different lived experiences in our society. One clear example of this is this quote that says, "Men fear women will laugh at them, women fear men will kill them." In no world are those two fears ever on par with each other. It isn't fun to be laughed at, but if that does happen, you will be fine. You can and should have the ability to regulate your emotions and move past it. Men murder because they may lack emotional regulation skills, and they know they're more likely to get away with it because of their privilege and the woman's lack of privilege. 34% of female homicide victims are killed by an intimate partner, while only 6% of men are killed by an intimate partner. And many of them may have been in a relationship with a man. Believe it or not, Certain professions can increase a woman's likelihood of being targeted by femicide. Female politicians are one such example. In the fall of 2020, 13 men were arrested for their plot to kidnap and potentially kill Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Women who work as journalists or defenders of human rights are also at increased risk of femicide, likely as a means to send a message that power belongs to men and that they should not encroach upon men's territory. Even in gaming, a virtual space, many men believe that they have a right to that space and that women do not. 59% of women and girls who game have experienced some form of harassment or abuse from male gamers, leading 34% of women and girls to avoid speaking in online games for fear of negative reactions, and 20% choosing to leave altogether. Of those who experienced online abuse, 14% had received threats of rape, 30% had been sexually harassed, another 30% had been sent inappropriate content, and 42% received verbal abuse. My guess is that these estimates, like many estimates of violence, are much lower than the actual numbers. It's not uncommon to hear that women are afraid to walk alone at night because of the potential for violence, but the real world isn't the only place men make women feel unsafe. Like with every issue we're exploring in this podcast, violence against women regularly disproportionately affects women of color. In Canada, for example, Indigenous women are victims of femicide at rates 5 times higher than that of white women. Similar to the Black Lives Matter movement, MMIW, or Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, is a movement focused on bringing visibility to the significantly higher levels of femicide that Indigenous women face. Race factors into things in ways that consistently center whiteness, such that when a white woman or girl goes missing, she gets around-the-clock news coverage for weeks on end. This is not to say that women like Gabby Petito, Natalie Holloway, Lacey Peterson, and girls like Danielle Van Dam and JonBenet Ramsey don't deserve attention and justice. But why do we all know their names and never hear an Indigenous woman's name front and center in the news, especially when they go missing far more often? We should absolutely care about violence against women, but we need to make sure we're advocating for all women and not just the ones that white supremacy has decided are deserving of our attention. Until next time, I'm Jake Ryan, and this has been Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism.